Okay, well, I see that it's 10:01, so we'll start our event. I'd like to welcome all of you. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you all for joining. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Dutch Studies program, and today also I'm wearing my second hat as that of director of the Institute of European Studies, and more specifically of the Benelux program we have at our Institute of European Studies. So welcome to today's event. Let me share my PowerPoint I prepared for you. Just a second. Here we are. Just a second. Okay, very well. So welcome to the event. Today we will be looking at the results of the elections, yesterday's elections in the Netherlands. Elections that, of course, have an interest for the discussion within the Netherlands about where the country is going politically, but also a discussion, I think, with some relevance for Europe as a whole, and essentially a discussion that also raises the question, to which degree did the COVID crisis affect the election results in the Netherlands? Was essentially the leading, was the government punished for its handling of the COVID crisis, or actually did it benefit in a way from the way it reacted to the challenges caused by the COVID pandemic? So we'll be discussing today Dutch elections. What you see here is the Dutch Parliament, the States General, as it is also called in The Hague. And most importantly, perhaps in this building, is the small tower you see here on the left, the little tower, as we call it, the little tower being the official residence of the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. So these elections will decide on who will then occupy that little tower in the years to come. Dutch elections are interesting. Elections because of the political system in the Netherlands. We're speaking here specifically about the House of Representatives, or the second chamber, as we call it in the Netherlands. It has 150 seats in total. And the Netherlands has about between 17 and 18 million inhabitants. About 13 million of those have an opportunity to vote in these elections. People are represented then in the House of Representatives, representing the political parties for which they campaigned. And as you can see on the color combination here on the screen, you see that there is a broad variety of political parties represented in the Dutch Parliament. And that too makes Dutch elections, I think, interesting, because it gives you a very clear idea about new ideas and new parties that pop up in Europe and all of a sudden do so well that they manage to elect representatives in Parliament. It's very easy in the Dutch political system to get into Parliament. You need roughly, I would say, about 100,000 votes. And if you reach that point, you get a representative in Parliament. So the Dutch system clearly benefits small parties, new ideas to get a representation in Parliament, which then, of course, has a flip side. And that flip side is that it makes it difficult to build a government, of course, because it's very difficult for one party to have more than half of the seats in Parliament. In fact, as far as I know, there never has been a situation in the modern democratic history of the Netherlands of one single party being in total control, which means that in practice, the government in the Netherlands has traditionally been a coalition government composed of several political parties. Let me start today's presentation with a brief 101 on the Dutch political system, and in particular on the Dutch political parties, to give you a little bit of background so you get a clearer idea on what parties are campaigning and what parties won and what parties lost in yesterday's general elections. Let me start by introducing the three traditional mainstream parties in the Netherlands. We have here on the left the CDA, which is a traditional Christian Democratic Party. A Christian Democratic Party, traditionally very strong in rural parts of the Netherlands. Yeah, I put a small map here on the slide. You see here in dark red, kind of the more urbane part of the Netherlands. That's essentially where the provinces of North and South Holland are located, also the province of Utrecht. That's kind of where you find the big cities, right? Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Haarlem, that's all over here in this dark red section. But you also have rural parts in the Netherlands. And that is where traditionally the Christian Democrats stood strong. Christian Democrats being a party that was formed in the 1970s when the leading Protestant parties and the Catholic Party decided to join forces and to kind of emphasize what they shared, namely Christian values. So it's you could say a morally, from a moral perspective, a more conservative party, but also with a strong social control, as you know, from a Christian perspective of charity, solidarity, but a party that traditionally stood very strong in rural parts of the Netherlands. But as you can see, I put a number underneath, and the number is the number of seats that this party had after the last general elections, and that number of seats is very disappointing for this party. It only kept 19 seats in the Dutch parliament on a total of 150. If the party founders would see this number, they would certainly turn themselves in their graves, because that's a very, very low number compared to the power that once upon a time this party had in the Netherlands. And the reason it has lost popularity is, of course, partially also the result of the fact that the Christian churches in the Netherlands, including the Catholic Church, have been losing members in the past decades. Less and less people in the Netherlands identify themselves as Catholic or as Christian. And of course, then this has consequences for this party. And the second traditional party I wanted to introduce to you is this one here in the middle, the Labour Party. And the Labour Party, obviously, traditionally a party that stood strong in urban centers in the Netherlands, the big cities where you have the workers, a party with strong connections to worker unions, a party that once upon a time was very powerful in the Netherlands, but as you can see at the number below it, an all-time low after the last general elections. This once upon a time very powerful party in the Netherlands lost votes to the point that today it only kept 9 seats in parliament after the last elections. So many people are eager to see, will this party in yesterday's elections pick up? Will it start growing again, or will this downward trend continue? It also raises another question: where did these votes go to, right? Because if the founding fathers of this Labour Party would see the number 9, would see that only 9 seats in parliament are occupied by the Labour Party, I don't think they would turn themselves in their graves. They would probably come out of their graves, because 9 is a very, very humiliating number of seats for this party. And then to the right, you see the third traditional party in the Netherlands, the VVD. What is the VVD? The VVD is what we call in the Netherlands a liberal party. Liberal in a European context, meaning something different than in an American context. Liberal here means in favor of a liberal approach to business, meaning a party that's in favor of open borders for trade, free trade, that embraces essentially the capitalist system. It is a party that traditionally, I would say, is a party that has been supported by company directors, but also, people who had the butcher, the baker. That was kind of the traditional constituency of this liberal party, the VVD. And if you look at the numbers, 33 seats in parliament, that's actually pretty good. Because traditionally this was kind of the smaller of the three, but now in recent decades we have seen that this party is the only one of the traditional parties that still stands relatively strong, right? It's on a total of 150, 33 is not that much, but compared to the other traditional parties in the Netherlands, this liberal party has been doing relatively well. So where did then the votes go, right? Where did the votes go from these traditional parties that once upon a time would just divide among themselves the 150 seats in the Dutch parliament? Well, this other part are the other parties that developed in past decades. First of all, on top you see two smaller Christian parties, and smaller Christian parties who didn't like this idea that Protestant parties and the Catholic Party were joined in the 70s, and they split off, and they kind of preserve a more conservative Christian identity. The one on the left, Christian Union, kind of with a social profile, so a little bit more to the left, you can say, with a focus on solidarity, on charity, the Christian unions, and then to the right, the hardcore conservative evangelical Christians of the SGP, a very conservative party. For a long time, the party even excluded females from leadership positions in the party, arguing that they lived according to the Bible, and Jesus Christ once upon a time had an opportunity to choose his apostles, and Jesus decided to choose only male apostles. He didn't select a single female apostle, and they interpret this as a sign that politics is a male affair, and that women should not be part of that. They were forced to change their position a bit on that, but it was definitely not wholeheartedly, so they remain kind of a hardcore conservative Christian party that people sometimes forget that it exists, right? Foreigners tend to look at the Netherlands with a focus on the city of Amsterdam, very progressive, very liberal, and they forget that there's also very conservative regions in rural parts of the Netherlands, and you see that reflected in such a party like the SGP. Then at the bottom, more left-wing parties. This D66 party is a party founded in the 60s that wanted kind of a more progressive approach to social issues, gender equality, discrimination, a party that in many ways I would say kind of corresponds a little bit to the norms and values you find in a city like Berkeley. But at the same time, a party that does not question capitalism, that is in favor of an open market, free trade, and all of that, but more kind of progressive in social issues, social matters. And as you see in the last elections, that party did actually quite well with 19 representatives in parliament. Then in the middle, you have the Green Party in the Netherlands, the Green Party that obviously has benefited considerably from the discussion on the climate crisis. At the same time, as you can see in the name of the party, it calls itself GroenLinks, which means that it identifies as green, but it also identifies as leftist. So it's a party with a leftist political tradition, relatively strong in Dutch parliament, 14 seats, right? And then here to the right, you have the SP, and the SP is essentially the also a leftist party, but on the far left. On the far left, the SP, as you can see, and its symbol is the tomato. And if you look careful at the tomato, you see that in the tomato, you recognize the symbol of Mao. It's actually a party that has its roots in a Maoist communist tradition. Of course, they modernized over time and adjusted to modern times, but still you can find kind of a reference to that legacy in this far left SP party. Relatively strong, 14 seats in the Dutch parliament before yesterday's election. So also interesting for us to see how did they do? Did they grow, or did they actually lose support? Let me then raise an important question. And that question is, there is one party you do not see here, and that is an extreme right party, right? There's no far right party here. And the reason is that the Netherlands, pretty much until the turn of the century, until the beginning of the 21st century, didn't really have a serious, powerful far right party. To the point that people in the Netherlands had a tendency, especially in cities like Amsterdam, to assume that it was not possible in the Netherlands for a far right party to get a strong public support. But that proved to be an illusion at the beginning of the 21st century, when this man came into play and had a major impact on Dutch politics. A man called Pim Fortuyn, who had an exceptional profile when you associate him with the far right. What made him exceptional is that, first of all, he was a sociologist, and I think you will agree with me that you know, you're not used to associate sociologists with the far right. And the second element that made him kind of exceptional as a member of a far right movement is that he was openly gay, and nevertheless he became the leader of a far right movement, with a story that he made very personal, and that definitely appealed to a lot of people in Dutch society in the early 21st century. A story whereby he would argue that once upon a time, he as a gay man could walk hand in hand with his partner wherever he wanted in Dutch cities, but that this was in the 21st century no longer the case. And it was no longer the case, he would argue, because of immigration, and because of people who had come to live in the Netherlands from countries where homosexuality is seen as sinful, is seen as something despicable. And he says essentially entire neighborhoods in Dutch cities transformed into neighborhoods where I, as a gay man, can no longer come hand in hand with my partner, because if I do that, people react in a very unpleasant way. And whenever Fortuyn would argue, I would address this problem with kind of the left-wing parties in the Netherlands, they would not listen to me. They would not listen to me because they would argue that essentially they were not open to discuss a connection between immigrant communities coming to the Netherlands and problems such as violence against members of the gay community, for instance. So he decided to create his own party, which he called the Pim Fortuyn Party, essentially, with a very simple message. I want, he said, to close the borders of the Netherlands, so no more new immigrants. And all of those who came in past decades, we will kind of come up with a strategy to make sure that these people embrace Dutch norms and values, including the acceptance of homosexuality. How he intended to do that, this point Fortuyn was very vague, but in spite of the fact that he was very vague about how he wanted to implement his ideas, in spite of that, his ideas gained strong support in Dutch society, to the point that at the beginning of the 21st century, he probably would have become the big winner of the elections. He may even have become the future prime minister of the Netherlands had he not been killed. 2 or 3 days before the elections in 2002, he was shot and killed by a person associated with anti-fascist, far-left anarchist movements. Pim Fortuyn was shot, and that caused, of course, a very emotional debate in Dutch society. You can see that on the scenes of the funeral of Pim Fortuyn, and then the whole discussion was, where will Dutch politics go now that Pim Fortuyn has been killed? And the one person who benefited most from that whole discussion on Fortuyn was this man, Geert Wilders, who capitalized kind of on the legacy of Fortuyn and created his party, the Freedom Party, a far-right party, a party that essentially wants to limit as much as possible immigration to the Netherlands, also profoundly Islamophobic. Pim Fortuyn, Geert Wilders compares, for instance, Islam to Nazism. He compares the Quran to Hitler's Mein Kampf, insists that Islam is not a peaceful religion, but a dangerous ideology. And in spite of this very far-right, very aggressive rhetoric even, Geert Wilders has become, as you can see, an important political force in the Dutch political system, gaining no less than 20 seats in parliament in the previous elections, making his party the second largest party in the Netherlands after the last elections. Also, by the way, with a very anti-EU rhetoric. Geert Wilders is a strong admirer of Brexit and dreams of what he calls a nexit, the Netherlands leaving also the EU. So another question of interest to us is to see, how did he do? How did his party do? Did he win or did he lose support in yesterday's elections? And then just very briefly, a number of small parties who made it into parliament after the last elections we had. New parties, for instance, here on the left, the 50+ party, a party that felt that people over 50 were not heard enough in the Dutch political system. The focus was too much on young people, and they felt we, the elderly, were being forgotten. So the 50+ party came into parliament with 4 seats. Also interesting here to the right, the Party for the Animals. So an animal rights party that has support from, I would say, all the way from you know, the grandma whose only remaining joy in life is her cat, to you know, the 18-year-old animal rights activist. You know, people support this party for the animals, the Animal Rights Party, and as you can see, it has 5 seats in parliament, which is quite considerable. Then here, also a new party called Denk. Denk is an interesting party, a party that split off from the Labour Party. And the reason they split off from the Labour Party is that these were people who were part of the Labour Party, but came essentially, these were people with an immigration background. They were children of immigrants, and they felt that the Labour Party had attracted people with an immigration background, but whenever the party made decisions, people with an immigration background were not taken seriously. And in particular, they were very upset about the whole debate within the Labour Party with regard to Turkey, and the whole question of the Armenian genocide. The Labour Party wanted to condemn Turkey, wanted to condemn the Turkish government by Erdogan. They wanted to condemn the Armenian genocide. These people warned the Labour Party, if you do that, many people in the Turkish community in the Netherlands will no longer vote for us. You can't be so harsh in your criticism of Erdogan. And when the Labour Party decided to nevertheless condemn the Armenian genocide and criticize Erdogan, they left. And they left and they created their own party called DENK, and they present themselves as the representatives of the immigrant community in the Netherlands. They present themselves as a party that fights discrimination of immigrants in Dutch society. And this split off definitely explains part of the lack of support that the Labour Party has had in past years. The decline in support for the Labour Party, decline first by Geert Wilders, because many of the people who voted for Geert Wilders and his Freedom Party in the past actually used to vote for the Labour Party. And it's very interesting to see that one of the parties that lost most support in Dutch society when the far right began to grow was actually the Labour Party. Especially white, blue-collared workers would switch from the Labour Party to the far right party. And now with DENK, then also many people with an immigrant background would no longer support the Labour Party, and they would switch to this new party called DENK. And then here, another new party that came into the Dutch parliament at the last elections, the Forum for Democracy, is actually a new far right party. A new far right party, a bit more intellectual than Geert Wilders. And they elected 2 seats in parliament. So now people with far right sympathies, so to speak, have 2 options, right? Either they can go for Wilders or they can go to this new party. Now, let me have a look briefly at the result at the past elections, 2017. And as you can see, a lot of parties in the Dutch parliament. How do you build a majority? How do you build a stable government? Not easy. And it took indeed quite a long time to build a government after the last elections. A government that eventually came to be composed, a government led by the largest party, right, the Liberals, who made an alliance here in the red color with the Christian Democrats, with the Democratic Party, and the more progressive Christian Party. This is how the previous government came into being, with a majority of 76 seats in the Dutch parliament, led by the leader of the largest party, whose name is Mark Rutte. Mark Rutte has been in prime minister for quite a while now in the Netherlands. It's one of the longest governing prime ministers in the EU. And the government he leads, as you can see, is a government composed of 4 different parties. His party, the VVD, being the largest with 33 seats in parliament. A few words perhaps on Mark Rutte as prime minister. Leader, as I said, of this liberal party, the VVD. Mark Rutte is a historian. He likes history. When Obama visited the Netherlands, he presented Obama with some ancient documents, which he as a historian finds fascinating. I think what they're looking at is actually the document from the 17th century when the Dutch West India Company bought the island of Manhattan from Native Americans, and where the Dutch then would build the city of New Amsterdam that later would be renamed New York. But it shows him as a historian. He still, even though he's prime minister, he still insists in teaching once a week in a high school. Because he likes teaching. He's a historian. He likes to speak about history. He also presents himself as a person who's very open, who is a good communicator. Many people in Dutch society tend to see him as a guy with whom you could get along, with whom you could get a beer. He likes to go to work on his bicycle. So he tries to give that image that he stands close to the Dutch people. And he has been quite popular now for quite some time as prime minister. He's famous for enjoying politics. You can clearly see that this is his passion. He loves politics. He always smiles, even when there's lots of problems, always smiles. Even when he was shaking hands with Trump, he would still keep smiling, although he had to make an effort, I think, in this precise case. But that's kind of the profile of Mark Rutte. And here you see Rutte with his government. And in the middle, you see the king of the Netherlands. And then next to him, Mark Rutte and his administration. An administration that I can say got along quite well. In the past 4 years, and there were relatively few conflicts within the coalition, which is exceptional because it's not easy to keep a coalition of 4 different parties united, but Rutte was quite successful in doing this. What I will do next is I will just briefly introduce to you some of the major crises that the Dutch society has been experiencing in the past years. And those crises, of course, had then consequences on the results of the elections that took place yesterday. And so first we will go over a number of crises that Dutch society faced in the past years, and then we will have a look at yesterday's elections results. So a number of crises. Let me start with the Brexit crisis. Brexit definitely major impact on Dutch society. Trade relations between the Netherlands and the UK are very strong. So the UK leaving the EU is a big problem for the Netherlands. Yeah? The whole bureaucracy nightmare. The trucks at the border, right? A big problem for the Netherlands. Also politically, because the Netherlands and the UK tended to be close partners within the European Union. Quite often the Netherlands would join the UK, or the UK would support Dutch interests in the EU. So the UK leaving the EU definitely caused concern in the Netherlands. Brexit definitely had consequences for the Netherlands. Also some positive consequences, I need to say, in the sense that several foreign companies who invest in the EU and who tended to have their headquarters in London have in the past years switched towards Amsterdam. Because they feel that remaining in London is difficult now with Brexit, and that to be present in the EU is actually to their advantage. and they perceive the Netherlands as a fairly stable country, a business-friendly country, hence the fact that quite a number of companies that used to have their headquarters in London decided, in consequence of Brexit, to switch those headquarters to Amsterdam, to the Netherlands. Second crisis, the micro mafia crisis. Micro mafia crisis relates to drugs trafficking, a big problem in the Netherlands. Not surprisingly, if you think about the location of the Netherlands, the largest seaport in Europe is located in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. Lots of drugs come to Europe through the harbor of Rotterdam. Hence, you have lots of drugs trafficking gangs in the Netherlands. And in the past years, gang violence has definitely gotten worse, in particular with one specific gang we call in the Netherlands the micro mafia, because this gang is associated with people with roots in Morocco, and a very violent gang where violence reached unprecedented levels when one member of this gang was arrested and decided of his lawyer to speak up against the other members of the gang, which usually never happens. Usually, if you're a member of a gang and you're arrested, you just keep silent, you don't say anything. And this man decided to speak up, and this led to a lot of violence. His own younger brother was shot and killed by the gang in retaliation for him speaking up. And what attracted even more attention was that even his lawyer, the man you can see here on the picture, his lawyer was shot and killed by the gang in retaliation for this gang member speaking up in court against the other members of the gang. And so definitely also major crisis in Dutch politics, that now even lawyers are no longer safe if they have clients who speak up against drugs trafficking gangs. Third crisis I want to briefly mention, Zwarte Piet crisis. Many of you may know who Zwarte Piet is, maybe not all of you. This relates to a Dutch popular tradition called the Sinterklaas tradition. It's kind of a children's celebration that is linked to a story of a saint, Sinterklaas, who allegedly comes from Spain to the Netherlands with lots of presents for the children. And according to legend, this saint then has a number of helpers who deliver the presents to the children. And these helpers, according to legend, are black Moorish helpers. Hence, according to tradition, people in the Netherlands on this holiday, they would either dress like a saint or they would dress like one of these black Moorish helpers, which means that they would paint their faces black. And this has become increasingly controversial in the past years. There has been a lot of protests against this tradition, especially from people from the Black community in the Netherlands. There's quite a strong, especially in the cities Amsterdam and Rotterdam, a large number of people with Afro-Caribbean roots who perceive this tradition as deeply racist, protested against it, and it definitely led to quite a debate in Dutch society, not just about Zwarte Piet, but in a broader sense about racism, police brutality, the type of discussions that we also, of course, are very familiar with here in the United States. Those issues were also very much debated in the past years in Dutch society. Another crisis, housing crisis. Housing crisis in the sense that the Netherlands is a small country, very densely populated, and houses have become increasingly expensive, which makes it difficult for young people to afford their own house. A major problem, how how do you build more houses in a country that is already so densely populated? And how do you build more houses when there is a climate crisis and we care so much about nature and the environment? Where do you build those houses, right? So a major crisis that also has been developing in Dutch society, which has been made more complicated by the climate and nitrogen crisis. Climate crisis, of course, you all know about. The nitrogen crisis, perhaps not. Nitrogen being a substance that is very bad for the environment. And if you look at this map of Europe and you see where nitrogen is in the soil, you clearly recognize over here where the Netherlands is a very dark color, which indicates indeed that the Netherlands has a major problem with the production of nitrogen. The production of nitrogen that gets into the soil and pollutes the soil. And nitrogen is essentially mainly produced in the Netherlands by cattle, cows, cows and pigs, very bad for the production of nitrogen. And so it's clear that the Netherlands need to reduce its cattle and we need to reduce the number of pigs, the number of cows, which causes a problem. It causes a problem for the farmers. There is pressure on farmers to reduce the numbers of cows and pigs and cattle in the Netherlands, which has led to farmers' protest. Farmers perceive that as a very hostile policy, and they think it's unfair. So quite some discussion in Dutch society on the climate crisis, and then specifically how do you reduce the level of nitrogen in Dutch soil. And it seems that the only solution really is that you reduce the number of farmers, which the farmers perceive as being a very hostile policy, hence very fierce protest from farmers against this policy. What other crises do we have? Major crisis in the child benefits. Child benefits in the sense that the Dutch government decided after some cases of abuse and fraud to be very strict about child benefits. But this strict policy had very negative consequences in the sense that people who were not fraudulent, but who made a small mistake when applying on these highly complex documents that you have to fill out when you apply for child benefits. They made a small mistake and because of the whole bureaucratic system, came to be seen and were labeled as fraudulent. People often who struggled with the Dutch language, who couldn't really understand those documents, just made a simple mistake, and then all of a sudden were labeled as fraudulent, had to pay huge fines, and that put a lot of people in big trouble, especially people from low-income families who did nothing wrong. All they did was they applied for child benefits, but they made a small mistake, but all of a sudden became labeled as fraudulent, had to pay fines, and major crisis, a major problem for these people. And it took quite a while for politicians to be aware that this actually was going on. And still today, it hasn't been entirely solved. Finally, the Corona crisis, a Corona crisis to which the Dutch government reacted originally by saying we just have to accept that there is a pandemic. Let's do the same thing like Sweden. Let's just protect the most vulnerable, and then other people will get infected, and then that's too bad. But hey, in a couple of months, our society will be immune, and that's the best way to fight this pandemic. Very quickly, the Dutch government had to revise this approach. When the images from Italy reached the Netherlands, and people would see all those terrible images of people dying in the hospitals of Corona, and the Dutch government switched its policy. It moved away from its original approach and adopted a much more restrictful policy, to the point that the Netherlands restricted, closed, of course, restaurants and all of that. Even the Netherlands even imposed a curfew at night. After 9 p.m., you're no longer supposed to be on the streets. And of course, for many people, that has, especially for younger people, of course, this is not at all a very pleasant thing to see happening. So this is essentially the number of crises I wanted to present to you. Let's have a look in the last quarter of our presentation at the consequences of these crises, how the government handled it, and what the results of yesterday's election were. Elections where people had a lot of choice, right? The Netherlands, very interesting country when it comes to politics. There's a long list of parties. You have all kinds of choices. It's not like in the United States, right? That if you don't like the Republicans, you're stuck with the Democrats. That's not the case in the Netherlands, right? There's so many options, so many parties for you to choose from. And many people did. Many people also voted by mail, which was kind of a new phenomenon in the Netherlands because of COVID, of course. But nevertheless, a very high turnout. 82% of the Dutch population voted in yesterday's elections. 82%. That's very high. Let's have a look at the results. And we start with the government, right? The VVD, Mr. Mark Rutte, with his strict policy with regard to Corona. Was that policy punished? Did he benefit perhaps from his policies? Let's have a look at the result. And what does the result show us? It shows that he used to have 33 seats and now he has 35, which indicates that he was definitely the winner, you can say, of yesterday's election. His party was already very powerful and now it even increases the number of seats. So definitely a vote of confidence in support of Mark Rutte, which essentially means that he will stay on as prime minister. He's by far still the leader of the strongest party in the Netherlands. Not a single other party comes close. So he will definitely continue as prime minister. Let's have a look at the other members of the Dutch government. The Christian Democrats, with a new leader who did not very well in the campaign, and you can see that reflected in the results. And the Christian Democrats were already at a very disappointing 19 seats, and now it's even worse. They went to 15 seats only. The Democrats 66, socially progressive party with a new leader, Sigrid Kaag, who did extremely well in the campaign. She has a background as a diplomat, speaks several languages. She's fluent in Arabic, for instance. She's married to a Palestinian man. She has a long career in diplomacy, very good debater, and she did exceptionally well during the debates, and definitely she made her party, or gave her party, a major victory. The party increases its number of seats from 19 to 24, which means that the Netherlands now has a new party that is in second position, so to speak. The second largest party is now the socially progressive D66 party. It's no longer the party of Geert Wilders, and we will see that in a minute. And then the final, the smallest member of the Dutch government, this leftist Christian Union Party, they had 5 seats and they keep 5 seats, which is actually not a bad result for them. But as I already indicated, Geert Wilders, the leader of the opposition, right? The largest opposition party, far right, Islamophobic, anti-EU. He did not well in yesterday's election. His party lost not much, but nevertheless, he lost a decline from 20 to 17 seats only, which means that now he's the third largest party and no longer the second largest in the Netherlands. The Green Party did extremely well at the last elections with a new leader, Jesse Klaver, young, energetic, good speaker. One of his parents has a Moroccan background, so for many he was seen as the person of the future in Dutch politics. Profiled himself as a strong, as someone who stood up against climate change. Benefited clearly from the Friday for Future campaigns, the climate crisis and all of that. But with the arrival of Corona, the attention of the Dutch population shifted away from the climate crisis. People were no longer interested so much as they had been before in the climate crisis. The interest was now much more on Corona, COVID, how do you combat the pandemic? People forgot a bit about the climate crisis, and you see the results. He lost half of his seats. So a dramatic defeat of the Green Party in the Netherlands, a reduction from 14 to only 7 seats. Very disappointing news for the Green Party in the Netherlands. What about the far left? The Bernie Sanders of the Netherlands, Lilian Marijnissen with the SP party, far left. Did they benefit from the whole, for all these crises we discussed and how the government reacted to these crises? The answer is no. Big defeat for the far left. From 14 seats, they go down to 9 seats only. So very disappointing. How about the traditional Labour Party? The traditional Labour Party, who somehow got involved also in this child social benefits support crisis, a crisis that already started at a time before the previous administration came into being, at a time when they themselves were still in the government, and that definitely didn't help Lilian Ploemen to recover and make the Labour Party larger. On the contrary, actually, what happened in yesterday's elections is that the traditional Labour Party essentially stayed at this all-time low of 9 seats. So no good news for the Labour Party either. What other parties? The Animal Rights Party, in spite of a change in leadership, in spite of the loss of its very charismatic political leader, nevertheless, they keep growing. They keep growing from 5 to 6 seats. Many people like animal rights in the Netherlands. 50 plus, the party of the elderly people in the Netherlands, also lost their leader. Internal fighting among the elderly in the Netherlands did not go well for the 50 plus party. They had to find in last minute kind of a new party leader. Not good. They go down from 4 to only 1 seat. The very conservative Christian party of the SGP, who wants to live according to the Bible, they had 3 seats in parliament and they stay with 3 seats. The immigrant rights party of Denk, they had 3 seats. There was quite some infighting among themselves. That didn't help, so they also lose. They lose 1 seat, they go down to 1. The new far-right party, the more intellectual far-right party, the one that starts to challenge Geert Wilders with a new approach, a more modern social media type of approach to the far-right, Thierry Baudet. They actually did very well. They grow from 2 to 8 seats in the Dutch parliament. So they become a relatively large party now in Dutch parliament. And then some new parties that tried to make it into the Dutch parliament. I have the results here for you. We have 4 new parties that made it into parliament. This one here, Bijeen, is a new party that focuses specifically on racial discrimination and how people of color suffer from racial discrimination in the Netherlands. And they made it. And they made it into parliament with 1 seat. This is also a new party here. The BBB party is the farmers' party. The farmers were so upset about the fact that the new policies tend to be restrictive on cattle breeding. They founded a new party, the Farmers' Party, and they managed to get a representative. Ja 21 is a new far-right party, a bit more moderate than the other far-right parties, and they made it into parliament with no less than 4 seats, so a big success for now a 3rd far-right party in the Netherlands. And finally, a very interesting party called Volt. Volt is a pro-EU party, a party that essentially want to transform Europe into the United States of Europe, a party that was founded in all EU states members, and wants to foster kind of a unification of Europe and a transformation of Europe into United States of Europe. That party also, to everyone's surprise, pretty much, made it into Dutch parliament with no less than 3 representatives. So a very surprising result for this new party, which clearly shows that, especially among young people in the Netherlands, there is this desire to support the EU, and to the point that they even created a new party and now have 3 representatives in parliament. Here you see all the results listed. The ones in red are the parties in the Dutch government. And what you can see is that the parties in the Dutch government overall did well. The only one who lost were the Christian Democrats. They lost 4 seats. The others actually stayed the same or increased the number of seats. And what is the conclusion when it comes to the future government? We don't know yet, of course. The negotiations and the debates will now start among the different parties. But my prediction is that it will not take long to form a new government. And my prediction is that the new government will actually be the exact same as the old government. My prediction is that most likely the Netherlands will keep a center-right government with the 4 parties that were already forming the government, because it has a very comfortable 80 seats majority. There's a potential to form a center-left government, but I think it's extremely unlikely that this will happen. I have 1 more minute, and in my last minute, I will make 2 predictions with regard to the future of Dutch politics. One prediction is that, as I said, the Netherlands will have the same government. They will have the same prime minister. The one change I see coming is that the Democrats 66, since they really won a lot of seats, they will put more pressure on progressive values in the Dutch government. And there will be more pressure on the Dutch government to be more EU friendly. So what you will see probably in the years to come is Prime Minister Mark Rutte being much more actively engaged in the EU. He will be, since Angela Merkel is stepping down, he will be the longest serving Prime Minister in the EU. So he knows how European politics works. He knows how to get things done, and he will definitely take advantage of that and be much more active, I think, in the context of EU policies. But he will be pushed by the D66 to have a bit more a progressive approach. Climate change will get more attention, I predict. I also predict that the Netherlands will tend to be more open when it comes to refugees. Rutte and his VVD party tended to be kind of very cautious with refugees and would not admit many refugees. The D66 has a much more liberal approach to that. So I do predict some change there as well. And overall, what you can see is that the liberal parties in general did very well. which means that the Netherlands will preserve this policy of being a business-friendly country, and that this will definitely be a policy that will characterize the Netherlands in the years to come. To conclude, I wanted to thank all of you for attending today's presentation. And for those of you who want to follow us at the Institute of European Studies, please go to the link below. It allows you to sign up for the lecture series we have at the Institute of European Studies. All the lectures are free and open to the general public. Everyone is welcome. And if you have an opportunity to give a small donation in support either of our Dutch studies program, we're very proud to be one of the few American universities with a Dutch studies program. We always appreciate that. And if you want to support the study at a research level of the Benelux countries in the Institute of European Studies, you also have an opportunity to do so when you go to the website of the Institute of European Studies, where you will find the Benelux program and an opportunity to support our Benelux program. Having said that, I will also just point out that my email address is here at the bottom. If you have any follow-up questions, I would be more than happy to answer those. But I see that it is already 11:02, and therefore I will conclude today's event with a big thank you to all of you for joining us. And I hope you learned something about Dutch politics, and we will see in the coming years where Dutch policies will evolve. But I'm confident that at least some of the predictions I shared with you will become realized. So thank you to all of you, and I hope to see you at future events at our Institute of European Studies. Thank you and goodbye.